Osamu took a deep breath, overwhelmed and above all unable to cope with the whole situation. His feelings were completely mixed up. On the one hand, he was sad, afraid, almost panicked that Atsumu would actually not wake up. On the other hand, he was so incredibly angry. After everything Suna had told him, he was furious at those who had put Atsumu in this situation. But he was also mad at himself for not stopping Atsumu, for not noticing how messed up the situation really was. Suna and Osamu headed towards the exit to get some fresh air. Osamu clenched his hands into fists when he suddenly caught sight of Sakusa at the end of the hallway. He flinched as Suna put his hand on his shoulder and looked at him with concern. "Hey, calm down." Osamu looked at him with wide eyes. If Suna hadn't been there, he pretty much would have charged at him again and probably would have been unstoppable. Osamu's blood boiled with rage. Sakusa walked toward the two, panic and concern written across his face. He was trembling, completely at loose ends himself. Suna frowned as he looked at him. Sakusa has been through a lot himself. "Don't worry, he made it. He's alive." "How is he?" Sakusa's voice was quiet, as if he was afraid of the answer. "He's stable, but he slipped into a coma." Sakusa's eyes widened, he turned pale. "Normally he should wake up in the next few days, we'll have to wait until then." Osamu and Sakusa stared at each other. If looks could kill, oh boy, Sakusa would now die the most painful, cruel, and disgraceful death imaginable. "See, can I go to him?" "Stay the fuck away from my brother." Suna's gaze snapped to Osamu, frowning at him. "Samu, if my brother doesn't wake up, it's all your fault. You were the one who gave Aiko the idea to hire Atsumu in the first place. Because of you, Atsumu was shot. You're responsible for all this." "Hey Samu, no, let me finish. I really don't give a shit if you feel bad for Atsumu right now, you're just a fucking hypocrite, Sakusa. You've just been shamelessly using Atsumu, never really loving him, so don't start acting worried now. I should have pulled him away from you much earlier, you're only bringing him bad luck. You don't deserve his love, so stay the hell away from him. If I see you here again, pray to God, because I don't know if I can hold back one more time. Just fucking stay away from Atsumu." Osamu gritted his teeth and scowled at Sakusa, his hands clenched tightly into fists. Both of them were shaking all over, the tension between them was unbearable. Sakusa tried to take deep breaths but his body wouldn't obey him. He was shaking, Osamu's words went under his skin. His gaze was fixed on the gray-haired twin. Osamu was serious, deadly serious. They looked at each other for a few seconds longer for what felt like years though, then Sakusa turned away from them and walked towards the exit without saying another word. "Samu." It was as if Osamu was snatched out of some kind of trance. He flinched and looked at Suna, still somewhat annoyed. Suna just gave him a pissed off and also angry look. "Are you fucking serious?" Osamu sat down on one of the seats that were on the hallway against the wall and buried his head in his palms, resting his arms on his thighs. He exhaled deeply. Osamu was at the end of his rope and he didn't need Suna hitting on him like that. "Apologize to him." Osamu looked at Suna pissed off. "You're kidding me, right? You know exactly how much Sakusa means to Atsumu and that Sakusa feels at least the same way about him. He's also been through a lot, don't you think this whole thing isn't affecting him too? He's worried about him. It's because of him that Atsumu is." "Oh my fucking god, yes Samu, it happened. But it's not Sakusa's fault, so stop taking it out on him. Whose side are you on, anyway? Don't you care about Atsumu?" "This isn't about taking sides. I'm not on Sakusa's side or on your side. I'm on Atsumu's side. I want Atsumu to wake up again and most of all I want Atsumu to be fine, and by sending Sakusa away, you're just achieving the opposite. Osamu and Suna looked at each other in silence for a brief moment, then Suna rolled his eyes and clicked his tongue. "Gee Samu, I swear you're the worst." He stood up and was about to run after Sakusa when Osamu suddenly grabbed his wrist and looked at him with wide eyes. "You're not going to follow him now, Suna?" Suna looked at his boyfriend for a moment, then tore himself away from him and continued running. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Suna. I'm serious. If you team up with Sakusa now, you won't see Atsumu in the future either." Osamu shouted after his boyfriend, the anger in his voice was unmistakable. Suna stopped, turned around, and glared angrily at Osamu. The corners of his eyes filled with tears, he couldn't believe what kind of ultimatum his boyfriend was giving him. "Fuck you, Samu." Suna turned back towards the exit and ran after Sakusa. He wiped the tears from his eyes with his sleeves before they had a chance to fall. He had never argued with Osamu like this before. Suna knew that Osamu was in an extreme situation right now and couldn't think straight himself, but he was still disappointed in Osamu. Osamu cupped his head in his hands again and sighed. He was shaking all over his body and tried to breathe slowly in order to calm down again. The whole situation was overwhelming him and was wearing him down beyond belief. Osamu was mentally at the end of his rope. "Shit, Atsumu. What have you gotten yourself into?" Suna ran out of the hospital and looked around. He could have sworn that Sakusa had run this way. He looked into the distance and wiped the remaining tears from his eyes. Suna watched the purple clouds. The sun's rays were about to fill the surroundings with warmth. It was already morning, almost 6 a.m. Just as he turned to walk back inside, he noticed Sakusa sitting on a bench somewhat hidden among trees. He made his way over to him and then slowly sat down next to him. Suna looked at him frowning. Sakusa was at his end. He also had injuries practically all over his body. His gaze was blank, emotionless. He seemed somehow broken. Suna noticed that his eyes were totally red. He must have been crying. He also noticed, despite the dark color, that Sakusa's clothes were soaked in blood. "Atsumu's blood? You should go home and rest, Sakusa." Sakusa didn't twitch a muscle, his gaze fixed on the distance. Suna sighed. He was completely ignored. Samu's words were harsh. Please forgive how he expressed himself. He's worried about his brother and can't handle the situation himself. He didn't mean it. Really? Sakusa let out a short breath and smiled mockingly. He meant it exactly that way. Suna frowned and swallowed. "Atsumu needs you." Sakusa's gaze snapped to Suna. He looked at him, aghast, panicked, and full of fear. "It's because of me that he's in this condition in the first place. Osamu was right from the beginning. I really am bad luck for Atsu." "Don't say that, Sakusa." Suna reached for Sakusa's hand and squeezed it a little. "Because of you, Atsumu is still alive. Because you acted so quickly, he was just able to survive. Sakusa, you saved him. If we want to get Atsumu back, we need you too. You are important to him. You have been from the beginning. He needs you, Sakusa." Sakusa and Suna looked into each other's eyes. Sakusa liked Suna. He had gotten along very well with him from the very beginning and knew that he really was a good soul. Sakusa was even more sure that Atsumu was in good hands if he ever woke up again. "I'll make sure to visit him when Osamu isn't around." Suna smiled weakly and nodded. "Thanks, Sakusa." He stood up and was about to head back to Osamu when he turned to Sakusa one last time. "Have a good rest. Make sure you recover too." Sakusa nodded to Suna and watched him disappear back into the hospital. Sakusa grabbed his ribs and contorted his face. His whole body was in excruciating pain, but he had refused to stay in the hospital as well. "No, instead Sakusa had made a completely different decision for himself. 1.5 years later. A year and a half has passed since Atsumu was hospitalized and went into a coma. A lot has happened in this time, but Atsumu has not woken up, his condition has not changed. Suna and Osamu took care of their cafe again. They made sure that in the evening, as soon as they would close the store, they would immediately pay Atsumu a visit. They usually baked fresh stuff for him, hoping that the smell might bring him back. Aiko took over her father's business and traded in precious jewels, all as she had always hoped, legally. The Suzuki name was highly respected in this industry, which made it extremely easy for her. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Aiko still needed guards at her side. Compared to the past, nothing had changed, yet a lot had changed in her life. She no longer had to fear for her life and was able to live freely. She needed protection from the guards only because she was dealing with valuable objects, not because she had to fear being killed at any moment. That was over. At her side, she had Komori, who not only made sure that nothing ever happened to Aiko, but also ensured the protection of the traded jewels and objects. In the meantime, Komori and Aiko became a couple. Since the incident with Seiki, they both realized that they could never do without each other. Time heals wounds, and so Osamu also realized that Aiko and Komori were really good friends of Atsumu. They often went to visit Atsumu together, but sometimes Komori and Aiko would go alone during the time that Suna and Osamu were at the cafe, so that someone was with Atsumu all the time if possible. Osamu's anger and resentment had subsided over time. He realized that everyone really only wanted the best for his brother and that they would do anything to bring him back. So far, it had all been in vain. The days when Atsumu didn't wake up turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months, and the months now into almost a year and a half. The chance that the blonde boy would ever wake up again was getting smaller and smaller, the hope was fading. Since Atsumu was in hospital and the situation between Osamu and Sakusa escalated, Sakusa never showed his face again. The words that had been thrown at him back then were deeply burned into his mind, and even though Suna tried to convince him that Atsumu needed him, he was gone anyway. Sakusa had left town, leaving Komori and Aiko a letter with the thought that Aiko would not need his protection anymore. He asked them not to look for him, because he would need time for himself. He would contact them when he was ready. But they hadn't heard from him in a year and a half. Sakusa had disappeared off the face of the earth, no one had heard a single word from him, not to mention ever seen him again. The last thing he wrote was that they should not worry. But was that even possible? In the state he was in at that time. It was a cold night in spring when Sakusa stood in front of the huge building, in which the lights were burning occasionally. Everything ended here, could he really go back? He took a deep breath and walked inside. The reception desk wasn't staffed, in general there weren't many people. Sakusa frowned and walked to the place he was most afraid of. He was lost in thought, pondering whether he was ready for this. Whether he would break down. Possible. He had no idea what was expecting him. Suddenly he bumped into a woman, he hadn't seen her at all. She was just standing there, looking through some papers that were now scattered on the floor thanks to the collision with Sakusa. "Oh no, I'm sorry." Sakusa bent down and helped the woman collect the documents. "Don't worry, we'll have that in a minute." Sakusa handed the papers to the woman and smiled awkwardly. "Oh. You're not a patient at all. Visiting hours are long over, it's the middle of the night." Sakusa swallowed, not wanting to be seen by anyone. He frowned. "I'll be out of here in a minute, I just wanted to see a friend before I leave town again." "Who do you want to see?" Dr. Kato raised her eyebrows as she returned her documents to a pile. She looked at Sakusa in surprise. "Atsumu Miya. Are you from his family?" Sakusa hesitated, then shook his head. We were good friends. And so much more. Ah, that's nice. The more friends that come to see him, the sooner he might wake up. He's still in a coma? Sakusa's heart sank into the pit of his stomach. All this time he had feared it, but still hoped that Atsumu had woken up by now. He had hoped that he had gone to the hospital completely in vain, since Atsumu was already back with Aiko, or at least with Osamu. And now the thing he was most afraid of happened. Atsumu hadn't woken up. He was not walking carefree through the world. He was still in the state Sakusa had last seen him in, and that was a year and a half ago. Unfortunately, yes. Come with me, I'll take you to his room. Dr. Kato led Sakusa to Atsumu's room and then left him alone. Sakusa put his hand on the door handle and hesitated to go in. His whole body was shaking, a lump was rising in his throat, and he felt so incredibly sick. As he opened the door he was literally struck by silence. The only sounds he heard were the constant noises of the machines that kept Atsumu alive and the recording of his heart rate. His heart rate, that was music to Sakusa's ears for now. Atsumu was alive. 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Sakusa slowly walked to Atsumu's bedside and sat on the edge of his bed. He took Atsumu's hand and looked into his face, relieved as he realized that Atsumu's hands were warm and not cold. He was indeed living. I'm so glad you're alive. His eyes grew misty, seeing Atsumu like this was killing him. He brushed a few strands from his face and kissed his forehead. Sakusa smiled weakly, a tear rolling down his cheek. Damn, he hadn't managed to suppress his tears now after all. His lips were trembling. You are such an idiot, Atsumu Miya. Why did you save me back then and not yourself? My life wasn't worth it? Sakusa's voice cracked, he lowered his gaze to his hand that he had locked with Atsumu's. He let out a deep, shaky breath, more tears running down his face. He looked back up into Atsumu's face. I miss you, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. I miss your constant chatter, I miss your lack of worries, I miss the way you tease me, your voice, your laughter. I miss you. Sakusa wiped the tears from his face with his sleeve, but more kept flowing. Sakusa sobbed. You were the only one who accepted me as I am. With you, I could be myself, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Sakusa stroked Atsumu's lips, his gaze fixed on them. After all this time, you've shown me how beautiful it is to love. Sakusa sighed. I wish I could feel your embrace just one more time. I wish I could be kissed by you just one more time. I wish I could hear you call my name, just one more time. Sakusa leaned over Atsumu, his lips touching the blonde boy's, but it was like that time. He didn't get kissed back. Instead, Atsumu just lay there lifeless. Sakusa's tears dropped down onto Atsumu's face, he whispered. I guess that's not possible anymore. He embraced his face and gently stroked his cheeks, his lips. Sakusa shivered, his heart breaking to see Atsumu like this. He took a deep breath, let go of Atsumu, and then walked towards the door. Before Sakusa opened it to leave the room, he turned around one last time and saw Atsumu lying motionless in the hospital bed. Another tear rolling down Sakusa's cheek, he whispered again. I love you, 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒄. Sakusa sighed. I always did. Then he left the room, the hospital, the city, once and for all. Atsumu's heart rate went up, the machine's sounds quickened and the blonde boy's eyelids twitched. His breathing grew heavier and his fingers started twitching as well. After a year and a half of inactivity, Atsumu's body moved for the first time at that moment. He frowned and unconsciously let something escape his lips. Oh Omi. Atsumu began to wake up.